The morning sun cast long shadows across the White House lawn as Karoline Leavitt adjusted her press secretary badge one final time. At just 27 years old, she had already made history as the youngest person ever appointed to this prestigious position. The weight of responsibility sat heavily on her shoulders, but her determination burned brighter than any doubt that tried to creep into her mind. As she walked through the corridors of power, staff members nodded respectfully, though she could sense the whispered conversations that followed in her wake. Many questioned whether someone so young could handle the pressure of speaking for the most powerful office in the world. Karoline had heard it all before during her confirmation process, and she was ready to prove every skeptic wrong. The press briefing room buzzed with activity as reporters from major networks set up their equipment. Karoline had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, studying every policy detail and anticipating the tough questions that would inevitably come her way. Her team had briefed her on the day's hot topics, but nothing could have prepared her for what was about to unfold. Among the sea of familiar faces in the press corps, she noticed something unusual. A tall figure in an elaborate uniform stood at the back of the room, his chest adorned with golden braids and ceremonial medals that caught the light. The man's posture was rigid, military precise, and his eyes held an intensity that made several reporters glance nervously in his direction. "Ma'am," her assistant whispered urgently as she approached the podium. "That gentleman in the back claims to be from the Royal Guard of Valdoria. He's requesting special diplomatic recognition for his questions." Karoline's eyebrows raised slightly. Valdoria was a small European nation known more for its tourist castles than its political influence. The idea that they would send a royal guard to a White House press briefing seemed almost absurd, yet here he stood, commanding attention simply by his presence. As she stepped up to the microphone, the room gradually fell silent. Cameras focused on her face, ready to capture every expression and word. This was her moment to establish herself as a force to be respected in Washington's political arena. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice clear and confident. "Before we start with today's briefing, I want to address the elephant in the room." Her eyes swept across the assembled reporters before landing on the uniformed figure. "I understand we have a visitor today who believes his royal credentials grant him special privileges in this democratic institution." The guard stepped forward, his boots clicking against the floor with military precision. "Lady Press Secretary," he announced in a thick accent, "I am Captain Henrik von Stauffen of the Royal Valdorian Guard. I demand immediate recognition and the right to question your president directly on matters of international sovereignty." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room as reporters exchanged glances. Some pulled out their phones to capture what was clearly becoming an unexpected confrontation. Karoline felt every eye in the room watching her response, knowing that her handling of this moment would set the tone for her entire tenure. The captain continued, his voice growing more commanding. "In my country, we show proper respect to those who serve the crown. I expect the same courtesy here, and I will not be dismissed by someone who barely looks old enough to vote, let alone speak for a nation." The insult hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in an old-world duel. Karoline felt her pulse quicken, but years of political training had taught her to channel anger into strategic thinking. She could feel the weight of history pressing down on this moment, knowing that her response would be analyzed, dissected, and remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. Behind the captain, she noticed other figures in similar uniforms entering the briefing room. They positioned themselves strategically around the space, creating an almost theatrical display of foreign authority on American soil. The situation was escalating beyond a simple diplomatic misunderstanding into something that could have serious international implications. Karoline's mind raced through her options. She could call security and have the guards removed, but that might create a diplomatic incident. She could acknowledge his royal status and risk appearing weak to the American press and public. Or she could do something entirely different. Something that would remind everyone present exactly where they stood and what values this building represented. The room held its collective breath as she leaned into the microphone, her decision made. What happened next would either establish her as a formidable presence in Washington politics or potentially end her career before it truly began. The young press secretary looked directly at Captain von Stauffen, her expression calm but her eyes blazing with determination. In that moment, Karoline Leavitt understood that some battles choose you, regardless of whether you're ready to fight them. This pompous display of old-world arrogance had picked the wrong person, and definitely the wrong place to make it stand. She was about to remind everyone present that in America, titles meant nothing compared to the democratic principles this building represented. The tension in the room was palpable, as reporters sensed they were about to witness something extraordinary. Phones were raised, cameras zoomed in, and even the usually jaded Washington press corps sat forward in anticipation. Whatever Karoline said next would echo far beyond these walls, potentially reaching every corner of the globe where people still believed that courage could triumph over entitlement. Karoline's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the kind of quiet authority that made seasoned politicians take notice. "Captain von Stauffen," she began, her tone respectful but firm, "I appreciate your dedication to protocol, but I think there might be some confusion about how things work in this particular building." She gestured gracefully to the room around them, her movement drawing every eye and camera lens. "You see, this is the White House press briefing room, where the principles of democracy and free speech reign supreme. Here, questions are earned through journalism credentials, not inherited through bloodlines or granted by crowns." The captain's face reddened slightly, his jaw tightening as he processed what he clearly perceived as an insult to his royal authority. "Young lady, I represent a sovereign nation with centuries of diplomatic tradition. Your president himself would not dare speak to me with such disrespect." A knowing smile played at the corners of Karoline's lips. She had anticipated this exact response, having studied the psychology of authoritarian personalities during her political science education. "Captain, with all due respect to your service and your nation, let me clarify something important about American democracy." She paused, allowing the moment to build as reporters leaned forward, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Social media was already buzzing with live updates from the briefing room, hashtags beginning to trend as news outlets picked up the story in real time. "In this country, we don't have subjects or peasants. We have citizens. And every citizen, from the janitor who cleans these floors to the president who works in the Oval Office, stands as equals under our Constitution. Your royal titles, impressive as they may be in Valdoria, carry exactly zero weight in this democratic republic." The captain's entourage shifted uncomfortably behind him, their ceremonial swords and decorated uniforms suddenly seeming more like costumes than symbols of authority. Several reporters were furiously taking notes, recognizing that they were witnessing a masterclass in diplomatic communication, disguised as a simple press briefing. "Furthermore," Karoline continued, her confidence growing with each word, "if you wish to observe our democratic process, you're absolutely welcome to do so. But you'll do it as a guest, not as someone demanding special treatment because of an accident of birth or appointment by a monarch." Captain von Stauffen drew himself up to his full height, his voice taking on a threatening edge. "I have diplomatic immunity and the backing of international law. You cannot simply dismiss me like some common citizen seeking an audience." The room crackled with tension as other reporters began to understand the broader implications of this confrontation. This wasn't just about one arrogant foreign official. It was about fundamental principles of democratic governance versus authoritarian privilege. Karoline nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his words carefully. "You're absolutely right about diplomatic immunity, Captain. That's a serious legal protection that we absolutely respect. However, diplomatic immunity protects you from prosecution, not from the consequences of inappropriate behavior in our democratic institutions." She turned slightly to address the broader room, her voice carrying the weight of historical precedent. "Throughout American history, we've welcomed foreign dignitaries, heads of state, and diplomatic representatives with the respect their positions deserve. But that respect has always been mutual, and it's always been grounded in recognition of our sovereign democratic processes." The captain's eyes narrowed as he realized that this young woman was not intimidated by his display of royal authority. In fact, she seemed to be using his arrogance as a teaching moment for everyone present about the fundamental values that underpinned American democracy. "What I find particularly interesting," Karoline continued, her tone becoming almost conversational, "is that your own king sent you here to observe democratic processes in action, Perhaps he hoped you might learn something valuable about how citizens interact with their government when fear and intimidation are removed from the equation. A collective intake of breath swept through the room as reporters realized she had just subtly insulted not only the captain but potentially his entire monarchy. Yet her words were so diplomatically phrased that it would be difficult for anyone to claim she had crossed any official lines. Captain von Staufen's face was now visibly flushed with anger. You dare suggest that our ancient and noble traditions are inferior to your chaotic democratic circus? I have served kings and queens while you were still playing with dolls, little girl. The personal attack hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. Every person in the room understood that this had moved beyond diplomatic discourse into something much more personal and potentially dangerous for international relations. Karoline felt the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. Her response would not only define her own career but could potentially impact diplomatic relations between two nations. Yet as she looked at this pompous representative of entitled privilege, trying to intimidate her in the very heart of American democracy, her resolve only strengthened. She knew that millions of Americans would eventually see whatever happened next, and she understood that her response would send a message about whether their democratic institutions could stand firm against bullying and intimidation from any source, foreign or domestic. The silence in the briefing room was deafening as Karoline processed the captain's personal attack. She could feel the collective holding of breath from every reporter, camera operator, and staff member present. This was the crucial moment that would define not just this confrontation, but potentially her entire career and America's response to international bullying. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, measured, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had just decided to make history. Captain von Stauffen, I want to thank you for providing such a clear example of exactly why democratic institutions exist in the first place. She stepped slightly closer to the microphone, her posture straightening with each word. You see, everyone watching today gets to witness firsthand the difference between earned authority and inherited privilege. The difference between respect that comes from service to others and demands for deference based on titles and threats. The captain's jaw clenched visibly as he realized that his attempt to intimidate had backfired spectacularly. Around the room, reporters were frantically typing on their devices, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would dominate news cycles for days to come. Now, Captain, Karoline continued, her tone taking on the patient quality of a teacher addressing a particularly difficult student, I'm going to ask you to do something that might be challenging given your background, but I think you're capable of rising to the occasion. The entire room leaned forward in anticipation. Social media was exploding with live updates, and news networks were beginning to cut to live coverage as word spread that something extraordinary was happening in the White House briefing room. Karoline pointed to an empty chair in the back row, her gesture both polite and unmistakably commanding. I'm going to ask you to sit down, boy, and observe how democracy actually works when people with real authority address the free press of a sovereign nation. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Several reporters audibly gasped, cameras zoomed in on both faces, and even the seasoned Washington press corps sat stunned by what they had just witnessed. A 27-year-old American press secretary had just called a foreign royal guard boy and ordered him to sit down in front of the entire world. Captain von Staufen's face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, disbelief, and something that looked almost like panic. His hand moved instinctively toward the ceremonial sword at his side, a gesture that did not go unnoticed by the Secret Service agents stationed around the room. The captain's entourage shifted nervously behind him, clearly uncertain about how to respond to this unprecedented breach of royal protocol. In their world, such direct insubordination to a representative of the crown would be unthinkable, possibly even treasonous. You cannot speak to me in such a manner, the captain stammered, his accent becoming thicker as his composure cracked. I am a representative of His Royal Majesty, a decorated officer with 30 years of distinguished service. Karoline nodded respectfully, but her position remained firm. And your service record is undoubtedly impressive, Captain. However, your 3 decades of experience serving a monarchy have clearly not prepared you for interaction with free citizens in a democratic republic. She gestured again toward the chair, her movement graceful but insistent. The seat is waiting for you. You can choose to sit down and observe democracy in action, or you can choose to leave and report back to your king that American democratic institutions remain strong enough to resist intimidation from any source. The tension in the room reached a breaking point as everyone waited to see how the captain would respond. This was no longer just a diplomatic incident. It had become a fundamental test of democratic principles versus authoritarian privilege playing out in real time before a global audience. Behind the scenes, phones were ringing in government offices across Washington as senior officials tried to understand the implications of what was unfolding. The State Department was frantically consulting international law experts, while the president's senior advisors debated whether to intervene or let their young press secretary handle the situation. Meanwhile, across the ocean in Valdoria, emergency meetings were being called as news of the confrontation reached the royal court. King Frederick himself was reportedly watching live coverage, trying to understand how his carefully planned diplomatic mission had devolved into an international incident. Captain von Stauffen stood frozen, his training warring with his pride. Everything in his background told him to maintain the dignity of his position and the honor of his uniform. Yet the eyes of the world were upon him, and he was beginning to realize that his usual tactics of intimidation and demands for deference were not only failing, but actively undermining his mission. The young press secretary waited patiently, her expression calm but determined. She had thrown down a gauntlet that challenged centuries of royal privilege and diplomatic protocol. Now the world would see whether democratic values could stand firm against the old ways of power and intimidation. What happened next would echo through diplomatic corridors for years to come, potentially reshaping how democratic nations interact with authoritarian representatives and setting a new standard for how American officials respond to international bullying on their own soil. The seconds stretched like hours as Captain von Stauffen stood paralyzed between his royal training and the reality of his impossible position. His breathing became visibly heavier, his decorated chest rising and falling as the weight of global scrutiny pressed down upon him. Behind him, his fellow guards exchanged uncertain glances, their usual confidence shaken by witnessing their leader's authority challenged so directly. Then, in a moment that would be replayed millions of times across every news network and social media platform in the world, something extraordinary happened. The captain's rigid military posture began to soften almost imperceptibly. His shoulders, which had been locked in perfect parade rest position, dropped just slightly. The fire in his eyes, which had burned with royal indignation, flickered and began to dim. He began, his voice carrying none of its earlier commanding authority. The word hung in the air, incomplete and vulnerable, as if he were searching for something that had never existed in his vocabulary before this moment. Karoline remained perfectly still, neither advancing nor retreating from her position. Her expression showed no triumph, no smugness, only patient dignity waiting for his decision. Around the room, reporters held their collective breath, understanding that they were witnessing a pivotal moment in international relations unfolding in real time. The captain looked around the briefing room, really seeing it for perhaps the first time since he had entered. He noticed the diverse faces of the press corps, men and women of different races, ages, and backgrounds, all united by their shared commitment to democratic principles and free expression. He saw the American flag standing proudly beside the presidential seal, symbols of a nation that had been built on the radical idea that all people deserved equal dignity. "Ma'am," he said quietly, the word carrying a completely different tone than any he had used before. The formal address was respectful without being subservient, acknowledging authority without surrendering his own dignity. "I believe I have misunderstood the nature of this institution." A ripple of surprise moved through the room as reporters realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. A representative of royal authority, actually, reconsidering his position in the face of democratic resistance. Karoline nodded graciously, her voice gentle but firm. "Captain, understanding often comes through experience rather than explanation. Democracy isn't something that can be learned from textbooks or royal protocols. It has to be witnessed, participated in, and sometimes even defended." The captain glanced back at his entourage, then at the waiting chair, and finally back to Karoline. "You called me boy," he said, not with anger but with something approaching wonder. "In 30 years of military service, no one has ever dared speak to me in such a manner. And how did that make you feel, Captain?" Caroline asked, her question carrying the weight of a masterful teacher helping a student discover an important truth. The captain was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with concepts that challenged everything he had been taught about hierarchy, respect, and authority. It made me angry, he admitted finally. Furious, actually. I felt my honor was being attacked, my dignity undermined. Caroline nodded, understanding. Now imagine feeling that way, not because someone challenged your royal appointment or your inherited privileges, but because someone tried to deny you basic human dignity simply because of who your parents were, what country you came from, or what you looked like. The implications of her words began to dawn on the captain's face. For the first time in his privileged life, he was experiencing a tiny fraction of what billions of people around the world felt when confronted by systems that treated them as less than equal simply because they weren't born into power. That anger you felt when I called you boy, Caroline continued, is the same anger that fuels democratic movements around the world. It's the anger of people who refuse to accept that some humans are born to rule, while others are born to serve. It's the anger that built this nation and continues to strengthen it every day. Captain von Stauffen stood in stunned silence as the full weight of her lesson settled upon him. His royal training had never prepared him for this kind of challenge, not to his authority, but to his entire worldview. He was beginning to understand that Caroline hadn't just insulted him. She had given him a glimpse into the revolutionary idea that all people possessed inherent dignity, regardless of their birth circumstances. Around the room, seasoned reporters were recognizing that they weren't just covering a diplomatic incident anymore. They were witnessing a profound philosophical moment that challenged fundamental assumptions about power, privilege, and human dignity. The captain's guards watched in amazement as their leader, who had commanded with absolute authority for 3 decades, grappled with ideas that threatened to reshape everything he thought he knew about leadership and respect. Social media exploded with reactions from around the globe. Some praised Caroline's courage in standing up to foreign intimidation, while others criticized her tactics as needlessly provocative. But everyone agreed that something significant was happening in that briefing room, something that went far beyond typical diplomatic protocol. In royal courts across Europe, monarchs and their advisors watched with growing concern, as one of their most decorated representatives appeared to be questioning the very foundations of inherited authority. This was exactly the kind of democratic influence they had always feared, and now it was being broadcast live to the entire world. What happened next stunned everyone in the room beyond their wildest expectations. Captain von Stauffen, this decorated representative of royal authority who had demanded special treatment and threatened diplomatic consequences, slowly began to lower himself toward the chair that Caroline had indicated. But he didn't just sit down, he moved with deliberate, almost ceremonial precision that suggested this was more than simple compliance. As his boots touched the floor in front of the chair, something remarkable occurred. The captain removed his elaborate military cap, revealing graying hair that spoke of decades of loyal service. He held the cap against his chest, not in defeat but with the kind of respectful attention that soldiers show during important ceremonies. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a clarity that hadn't been there before, "I request permission to observe these democratic proceedings as a student rather than as a representative demanding special privileges." The room erupted in surprised murmurs as reporters realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in international diplomatic history. A royal guard was voluntarily surrendering his claimed authority and asking to participate as an equal citizen in democratic discourse. Caroline's expression softened slightly, though she maintained her professional composure. "Permission granted, Captain. Please take your seat and experience firsthand how free people interact with their government representatives." But the captain wasn't finished. As he settled into the chair, he gestured for his entourage to do the same. "Gentlemen," he addressed his fellow guards, "I order you to observe and learn. Remove your ceremonial swords and sit as guests in this democratic institution." The other guards looked uncertain, clearly struggling with orders that contradicted everything they had been trained to believe about royal protocol. One by one, however, they followed their leader's example, carefully placing their ceremonial weapons in a respectful pile and taking seats among the press corps. "I have a confession to make," Captain von Stauffen continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent room. "Before coming here, I was briefed that Americans were weak, that their democracy was chaotic and ineffective. I was told that a show of royal authority would easily intimidate your representatives into granting special privileges. Karoline listened intently, recognizing that this moment was evolving into something far more significant than anyone could have anticipated. This wasn't just diplomatic theater anymore. It was becoming a genuine exchange of ideas between two completely different worldviews. Instead, the captain continued, I have encountered something I did not expect to find. Strength that comes not from titles or inherited power, but from principles that can withstand any challenge. I have seen authority that is earned through service rather than demanded through birthright. Around the room, reporters were frantically taking notes and sending updates to their news desks. This story was evolving far beyond what anyone had imagined possible when they arrived for what they thought would be a routine press briefing. The captain looked directly at Karoline with something approaching respect. When you called me boy and ordered me to sit down, you did something that no one in my entire life has ever dared to do. You treated me not as a royal representative demanding deference, but as a human being who needed to be reminded of basic principles of equal dignity. Social media was exploding with reactions from around the world, and "Sit Down Boy" was trending globally. But the conversation was evolving beyond simple slogans into deeper discussions about democracy, privilege, and human dignity. International news networks were providing live coverage as the story developed into something much more profound than a diplomatic incident. I want to thank you, Miss Leavitt, the captain said, using her name with genuine respect for the first time since entering the room. You have given me a gift that I did not know I needed. The experience of being treated as an equal human being rather than as a symbol of inherited authority. Karoline nodded graciously, but she wasn't done teaching. Captain, what you're experiencing right now is something that every American citizen has the right to expect from their government representatives. We serve the people, not the other way around. That's what makes democracy strong. It's built on the revolutionary idea that government exists to serve citizens, not to be served by them. The captain absorbed her words with the intense focus of someone encountering a completely new way of understanding human relationships and social organization. In my country, he said slowly, citizens serve the crown. Here I see that the crown serves the citizens. It is a remarkable difference. Behind the scenes, urgent phone calls were being made between the White House and the State Department. Senior officials were trying to understand whether this was a diplomatic disaster or a triumph of American democratic values. The president himself was reportedly watching live coverage, fascinated by how his young press secretary was handling an impossible situation. Meanwhile, in Valdoria, King Frederick was facing his own crisis. His carefully planned diplomatic mission had not only failed, but had resulted in his most trusted guard publicly questioning the fundamental principles of royal authority. Emergency meetings were being called to determine how to respond to this unprecedented challenge to monarchical dignity. The captain's transformation was being witnessed by millions around the globe, and it was inspiring conversations about democracy and human dignity in countries where such discussions were often discouraged or forbidden. This was becoming much more than an American news story. It was evolving into a global moment that challenged people everywhere to reconsider their assumptions about power, authority, and human worth. The aftermath of that extraordinary press briefing reverberated around the world with an impact that no one could have predicted. Within hours, the video of Karoline Leavitt telling Captain von Stauffen to sit down, boy, had been viewed millions of times across every social media platform. But it wasn't just the dramatic moment that captured global attention, it was the captain's remarkable response and transformation that truly stunned the international community. In the days following the briefing, Captain von Stauffen made a decision that shocked his homeland and inspired democracy advocates worldwide. He formally requested political asylum in the United States, citing his newfound understanding of human dignity and democratic principles. His application included a detailed letter explaining how his brief experience in the White House briefing room had opened his eyes to possibilities he had never imagined. For 30 years, I believed that order came from hierarchy and that respect was something demanded from above, he wrote in his widely published asylum letter. In 30 minutes, Miss Leavitt taught me that true order comes from justice and that respect is something earned through service to others rather than demanded through titles and threats. The captain's asylum request created an international diplomatic crisis. King Frederick of Valdoria demanded his immediate return, threatening economic sanctions against any country that harbored what he called a traitor to the crown. But Captain von Stauffen had become a symbol of democratic transformation that resonated far beyond American borders. Meanwhile, Karoline Leavitt found herself thrust into the international spotlight in ways she had never anticipated. Foreign policy experts debated whether her approach had been brilliant diplomacy or dangerous provocation. What no one could deny, however, was that her firm stand against intimidation had demonstrated the strength of American democratic institutions to the entire world. The impact on Valdoria was swift and dramatic. Citizens who had watched the live stream began organizing peaceful demonstrations, demanding democratic reforms and questioning the absolute authority of their monarchy. The hashtag #DaShungSitDownBoy became a rallying cry for democracy. Movements in countries where royal authority had long gone unchallenged. Frederick's response revealed the brittleness of authoritarian systems when confronted with democratic ideas. He banned internet access to prevent his citizens from watching the video, ordered arrests of anyone found discussing the incident, and demanded that international media stop covering what he called seditious American propaganda. But the damage to royal authority was already done. Other members of the Valdorian Royal Guard began defecting, crossing borders into neighboring democratic countries and requesting asylum. Each defection was accompanied by testimonies about how witnessing Captain von Staufen's transformation had inspired them to seek lives based on human dignity rather than inherited privilege. The captain himself became a powerful advocate for democratic values, speaking at universities and international conferences about his experience of discovering human equality. His transformation from royal enforcer to democracy advocate inspired similar movements in other monarchies and authoritarian regimes around the world. When Miss Leavitt told me to sit down and called me boy, she was not insulting me, he explained in interviews. She was treating me exactly as I had been treating ordinary citizens my entire career, with dismissive authority. For the first time in my life, I experienced what it felt like to be on the receiving end of such treatment, and I understood immediately why it was wrong. Karoline's career was transformed by the incident as well. She became the youngest person ever to receive the International Democracy Award, recognizing her role in demonstrating how democratic principles could peacefully triumph over authoritarian intimidation. Foreign policy schools began teaching the Leavitt doctrine, the idea that democratic institutions should never compromise their principles to accommodate authoritarian demands for special treatment. The broader impact extended far beyond individual careers or even single countries. The incident sparked a global conversation about the nature of authority, respect, and human dignity that influenced democratic movements on every continent. Video clips of the confrontation were translated into dozens of languages and shared in countries where open discussion of democratic principles was dangerous. Years later, historians would mark that press briefing as a turning point in the global democracy movement. It demonstrated that individual courage, principled stands, and unwavering commitment to democratic values could create ripple effects that transformed lives and challenged entrenched systems of privilege around the world. Captain von Stauffen, now an American citizen and professor of political science, often concluded his lectures with a simple observation: democracy is not about perfect people making perfect decisions. It is about ordinary people having the extraordinary courage to treat each other as equals, regardless of the titles or privileges they were born with. Karoline Leavitt continued to serve with distinction, but she never forgot the lesson of that remarkable day, that sometimes the most important moments in history happen when ordinary people simply refuse to be intimidated by those who mistake inherited privilege for genuine authority. The empty chair where Captain von Stauffen had sat during that briefing became an informal symbol in the White House press room, reminding everyone present that true authority comes from serving others rather than demanding service from them. And around the world, millions of people who had watched that confrontation carried forward the revolutionary idea that all humans deserve to be treated with equal dignity, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. The nation, and indeed the world, had been stunned not just by a young press secretary's courage, but by the profound truth that democratic principles, when firmly upheld, possess the power to transform even the most entrenched systems of privilege and authority.